Hi there, I'm Greg Harm. I was born and raised in Lincoln, Nebraska, and now I live in Austin, Texas. And a few years ago, I had the pleasure of going to New York City and went there on a business trip with my wife and got to see Rockefeller Center. And one of the things that I learned when I was at Rockefeller Center was that the Atlas, which you see a lot of times on Saturday Night Live, and the polychrome figures that are above the front of 30 Rockefeller Plaza, these were all done by the 20th century German-American sculptor Lee Lawrie. Now, Lee Lawrie lived from 1877 to 1963, and he became a sculptor when he was about 14 years old. He apprenticed under some of the greatest sculptors in the world at the Chicago Columbian Exposition of 1893. And throughout his life, Lawrie was an architectural sculptor. And in 1895, he had seen a church in Ashmont, Massachusetts that was designed by Bertram Goodhue, when Goodhue was with Cram and Ferguson, I believe, at that time. And he was impressed with it, so he decided he wanted to present himself to Mr. Goodhue as a sculptor for his buildings. He admired his work so much. Well, this partnership lasted until Goodhue's death in 1924. So they spent approximately 29 years working together. They worked on over 100 buildings around the country. And what I have come to find out, that the largest building that Lawrie ever did, or that Goodhue ever created, and the largest body of work that Lee Lawrie ever did, was at the Nebraska Capitol. So when I learned this, I was kind of astonished that Lee Lawrie had ended up doing the sculpture for the Nebraska Capitol. In 1920, Nebraska was a relatively small Midwestern city of about 100,000 people. And at that time, the old Capitol was crumbling, so they wanted to build a new one. So what happened was they had a national competition. And they judged, they said they wanted something that was new and powerful and would represent the state. It was also supposed to serve as a memorial to the Nebraska dead from the First World War. So they had this competition. The competition was chaired by Thomas Kimball. And Kimball was an Omaha architect who had designed the Fontanelle Hotel, and he had Eastern connections, and he was educated back east, so he had a lot of connections to the architectural community nationally. He was also the president of the American Institute of Architects, so he was well respected throughout the country. So they had this competition, and Goodhue won, and Lawrie became the sculptor for the building. Now, what is amazing about the building is, originally it started out, Goodhue, his background was mostly in churches. He built a few libraries and this sort of thing. But as he went along, he got more into civic buildings. So as he did this, he ended up bringing in Dr. Hartley Burr Alexander as a thematic consultant. The purpose of the building was supposed to tell people about the heritage of Nebraska, the Native American history of the people that lived there before the Europeans came, and then the Europeans, it was supposed to stress the institutions of government that they had brought with them when they came to settle the state of Nebraska. Nebraska became a state in 1867, so it was just after the Civil War. Now, one of the most interesting things about this work, as I said, is that Lawrie had created work all over the country. The two of them, they worked on buildings in, they had churches in Cuba, they had buildings, the National Academy of Sciences building in Washington, D.C., and they did the Los Angeles Public Library as well. So Goodhue was a fairly well nationally known architect at the time. And what was interesting about Goodhue was that he presented a new style of architecture. Most of it was, the architecture of the day was primarily what they call Beaux-Arts, which is kind of boxy looking, but it had some decoration to it. Afterwards, after World War II, architecture took a turn to the international style, And the international style basically didn't use any decoration on buildings at all. It was just form follows function. So they wanted it to be extremely simple. And just it's kind of led to the whole glass and steel box skyscrapers that you see so many of from the post-war period. But getting back to the story here, Lawrie was born in Germany. He came to the United States when he was 4 years old with his mom. She was widowed, she was very poor. She raised him in Chicago, and he consequently had kind of a hardscrabble youth. A number of times she had to put him in orphanages because she couldn't afford to take care of him. She was a seamstress and a housekeeper. So she wasn't the most skilled person in the world. But anyway, despite this background, Lawrie grew up, became this sculptor. He ended up teaching sculpture for a decade at Harvard, and a decade at Yale from 1908 to 1918. At the same time, he was still working with Goodhue and working on a number of buildings. They worked on West Point and a number of churches in New York City. But anyway, what I wanted to show you, if I can in these, are some of the photographs of Lawrie's most influential work. And I hope this works because I haven't made a video like this before. So, most people recognize the Atlas in New York City, and you see that on Saturday Night Live, as I mentioned. And so once I had seen this, I was very much amazed about it. The other thing that I found out when I was in New York City, that Goodhue was buried in a church called the Chapel of the Intercession in New York City, which is, this shows his tomb, and on the side here you can see a picture of the Nebraska Capitol that's in this church at 155th and Broadway in New York City, and that effigy there is Goodhue, and that was the tomb that was dedicated to him in 1929. So anyway, as we go through the book, I point out that most people have never taken the time to stop and see the Nebraska Capitol. Most people, if they see it at all, it's from this little speck up in a jet airplane, which you can't really see in that picture. But anyway, most people don't stop and look at it. But as I said, this building was supposed to represent the way democracy emerged. One of the biggest programs of the building is the history of law, which is also called the development of law. And this tracks the development of law from the Ten Commandments down through the Greek and Roman times, up through early English common law in the 6th and 7th century, the 13th century when you had the development of the Magna Carta, and then colonial law and American colonial law and the Emancipation Proclamation and a number of projects. Well, each one of these panels is a 5-foot by 9-foot limestone panel. These were carved by a man named Alessandro Beretta, and some of these panels he would take up to 10 weeks to carve. I mentioned Alexander. This is Dr. Alexander. He was the one that came up with the whole program of sculpture that he and Lawrie would follow. But as you go through the book, it traces, in doing the research for the book, I went to the Library of Congress where I found Laurie's scrapbooks in his archives. And he had a number of photographs that trace the development of his sculpture. And originally, before 1920, he was primarily working on religious sculptures. And then, because he was at Yale, I theorized that he was very much exposed to the European influences of Art Deco as they were coming across to the United States. You had a lot of influence from the